All right, how's everybody doing? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, writer, and historian. So it is Monday, January 20th, 2020. Dr. King Day. So I hope everybody's doing well today. I know a lot of people went to Dr. King Day celebrations today, as I did. Didn't speak at one this year because I wasn't asked to speak at one this year. That's another whole long story. But I want to talk about Dr. King and his legacy and continue a discussion from Sunday night on my radio show, the African History Network show. Okay, because I have limited time there, but I want to deal with Dr. King, Muhammad Ali, and Malcolm X. And Dr. King was the most hated man in America when he was assassinated April 4th, 1968. So why was Dr. King the most hated man in America? And we'll deal with Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali. We'll deal with the secret friendship that Dr. King and Muhammad Ali had as well. And they both came out in opposition to the Vietnam War in April, publicly, in April of 1967. Okay, Dr. King delivered his first speech in opposition to the Vietnam War called Beyond Vietnam. That was April 4th, 1967. And then later that same month, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the Army. That was April 30th, 1967. All right. So everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. You're going to learn a lot, hopefully. And then also African American business owners, you can post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast as well. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network, okay? If you like this type of information, also you could donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. That really helps out a lot, helps me to keep doing the research, take care of, pay the bills, stay on the air, keep broadcasting our Sunday night show, etc. And then I posted it here on our fan page today, it's a 2.5-hour lecture I've done, The Distortion of the Legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Revolutionary Will Not Be Televised on the Television. Okay, so we have that in DVD format and digital download format, so that's on sale right now also. So it's at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, and I just posted the link here on the thread of the broadcast. Okay, so let's jump into this. Every Dr. King Day, I read a lot of articles that are written that tie in what's going on today with the past, etc. And we saw that Donald Trump made an idiotic tweet today tying Dr. King Day to January 20th, 2017 and his inauguration, and just a bunch of nonsense. So the first article I want to look at is from SmithsonianMag.com, which is the official website of the Smithsonian Institute. This is from 2018. It's a really good article. It's from April 4th, 2018. And that was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. It's entitled, Even Though He Is Revered Today, MLK was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. Even though he is revered today, MLK was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. Okay, so there was a Harris poll that was given in 1968, and Dr. King had a disapproval rating, a public disapproval rating of nearly 75%. And this figure is shocking when we contrast that to the beloved Dr. King that is promoted to us today on the television. All right, every Dr. King Day. And this is part of the reason why I said on my show Sunday night, I've said this before, and Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen said this years ago. He said, we did Dr. King a disservice when we went to the federal government to try to get a holiday to honor him. He said, we don't ask permission to honor our heroes. I'm paraphrasing. If we want to celebrate Dr. King, we just celebrate Dr. King. We don't go to the government that killed him asking for a holiday to honor him. Because when you do that, what happens is they distort the image of your hero to then make him palatable and acceptable to a broader audience, mainly white people. And this is what has happened. It's the same thing that happened with Malcolm X when Malcolm X got a U.S. postage stamp. They sanitized Malcolm to make him acceptable to white people. Okay? So, and just to give you a quick example of this, right? So I was at the U.S. Post Office. The main branch post office in Detroit is on 4th Street, down the street from Wayne County Community College. Okay? And I was there a few years ago, sometime after the Malcolm X postage stamp came out. Malcolm's one of my heroes. You see the picture of Malcolm behind me. I have to get a picture of Dr. King because you see Malcolm, you see Muhammad Ali behind me, 2 pictures of Muhammad Ali. And also, we know January 15th is Dr. King's birthday. January 17th is Muhammad Ali's birthday. I had to get a picture of Dr. King as well. But I was at the main branch post office. And I was standing in line because I do a lot of shipping out orders. And there was a showcase there of plaques that the U.S. Postal Service was selling. And the showcase had, I think, 3 or 4 shelves. So on one shelf, they showed, they had plaques of U.S. military men in uniform. One for the Army, I think one for Marines, right? And they showed the military men with guns, okay? And like for the Army, they had maybe 3 U.S. soldiers in uniform. One of them was African American, but they showed them with guns. They're automatic weapons, right? Probably M16, something like that. So then they had a plaque that had a rendering of different famous depictions of Malcolm and different famous poses of Malcolm. All right. So I think there was one picture of him with his hand on the side of his face like this. They had some different, historical depictions of Malcolm. It was a rendering of it. Okay. So it wasn't a photograph. Okay. It was a rendering. But they had the famous depiction of Malcolm where he's looking outside of the window and he has an automatic rifle in his hand, a machine gun in his hand. Everybody's seen that picture because people were trying to kill him, right? Everybody's seen that photograph. Well, in this rendering, he's looking out the window and his hand is like this, but there's nothing in his hand. They took the gun out of his hand. Now, the shelf below it, they showed white men with guns wearing military uniforms. Some of them were African American. Here, you have Malcolm in a famous depiction most people have seen, and he's holding his hand, but there's no gun in his hand. This was from the U.S. Postal Service. This is an example of what happens when you try to get a government who killed your leaders to try to honor them. Yes, they are deserving of being honored, but it's not logical. It's nonsensical. I know people meant well and sacrificed things like that. It's not logical. So this is why we should not go to the federal government to get them to honor any more of our heroes that they killed. If we want to celebrate Malcolm, we celebrate Malcolm's birthday May 19th. We don't ask permission. We celebrate Marcus Garvey's birthday August 17th. We don't ask permission. We'll celebrate Fannie Lou Hamer. We'll celebrate all of our heroes. We don't ask permission to celebrate them. Okay? Because what happens is they get co-opted. And then they get represented back to you. You don't even recognize who the hell they are. All right, so let's continue. How's everybody doing? Deshaun, Farad, how you doing, brother? John Butch, Jackie. Everybody share this broadcast. You ain't gonna hear this type of information other places, right? And see now once again, now this is one of the reasons why I don't get asked to speak at the corporate breakfasts and the corporate sponsored lunches dealing with Dr. King, because I deal with the revolutionary Dr. King. Okay, I don't deal with a Dr. King. I don't deal with Dr. King trying to make white people feel comfortable with the oppression of African Americans. All right, I don't do that. Now at the same time, when I talk about history and Dr. King, I'm not trying to attack white people. All right. At the same time, I deal with facts and evidence. I'm not trying to attack white people, but I don't deal with Dr. King trying to make white people feel comfortable with our own oppression. No, not at all. All right, and you have some well-meaning white people who understand the facts, right? As well. Okay, I think they're called allies, I guess. All right, now, so we had this Harris poll, 1968. Dr. King had a public disapproval rating of nearly 75%. Now, white racial resentment was still a critical factor at this point, 1968. But Dr. King, his unfavorable numbers were at least 25 points higher in 1968 than in 1963. And his faltering appeal over the final years of his life was also a consequence of appearing to fall behind his times in some respects, even as he was leaping well ahead of them in others. Okay, and just very quickly, I forgot to tell you, I said you could donate to the African History Network. Forgot to tell you how. I'm going ahead of myself. Cash App, we have Cash App now, $ the AHN Show, or through PayPal, paypal.me /the AHN Show, paypal.me /the AHN Show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button. I posted the link here. I forgot to tell you that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. All right. So, a day after returning home in December 1964 from a tour whose most important stop was Oslo, Norway, okay, to get the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel laureate for peace joined a picket line at Atlanta's Scripto Pen Factory, P-E-N, writing pens. Atlanta's Scripto, S-C-R-I-P-T-O, Pen Factory, where some 700 workers were striking for better wages for less skilled employees. Now, what's interesting, when I hear Republicans talk about Dr. King, they talk about a Dr. King loving everybody and wanted everybody to get along and come together. Dr. King was calling for a radical change of values. He wasn't talking about everybody getting along. He was talking about people changing their values. He was talking about fair wages. He was talking about a living wage. See, when I hear a lot of people talk about Dr. King, they totally leave out the economic portion. They leave out the economic boycotts. They leave out him talking about redistributing the pain through targeted sustained economic withdrawal. And they turn him into what Dr. Cornel West called the Santa Clausification of Dr. King. He's turned into this little old sweet old man that everybody loves. No, that's not Dr. King. Dr. King was a revolutionary. This is why his legacy has been distorted. Okay? So this is why we have to study the real Dr. King so we don't fall for this nonsense, this okie doke. So you have Atlanta's Scripto Pen Factory, where some 700 workers were striking for better wages for less skilled employees. Though it was a remarkably humble gesture for someone who had received such a lofty affirmation, the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. King's actions that day and his call for a nationwide boycott of Scripto products won him few friends in his hometown's white, staunchly anti-union business community. He's calling for a nationwide economic boycott. And see, when we talk about targeted sustained economic withdrawal and concepts of redistributing the pain, and if I have a whole lecture called Redistributing the Pain, how I do historical examples of how African Americans fought back against white supremacy and racism through different types of targeted sustained economic withdrawal strategies, right? When you have these boycotts, is never just locally. It's always nationally. That's where your strength is, okay, if you're dealing with a national chain. We saw an example of this if you watch Eyes on the Prize. You watch I think it was the third installment, which deals with 1960 to 1961. It's called Ain't Scared of Your Jails. Everybody needs to watch that. Now, there's some real problems with Eyes on the Prize because the aspect of the civil rights movement that dealt with armed self-defense is not dealt with in Eyes on the Prize. Because as one of my teachers, Professor James Small, clearly told me, and there's evidence to prove this, the civil rights movement, contrary to popular belief, and we're going to get into that tonight or today, contrary to popular belief, the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. If it had not been for Negroes with guns, there would not have been a civil rights movement. Don't take my word for it. You can look at you can read the book by Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. was a field secretary for SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was founded in spring of 1960. SNCC comes out of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded in 1957, co-founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker. We got to talk about Ella Baker. When we talk about the civil rights movement, we'll talk about Rosa Parks, who's the mother of the civil rights movement, okay? And we need to talk about her. But we got to talk about Ella Baker as well. Ella Baker gets pushed to the side. Ella Baker helps to co-found SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. All right? But we see that you're going to have Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. wrote a book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And he was a field secretary for SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in rural Mississippi for 5 years. He's a history professor. And he talked about how, so I think the first time I saw him, Roland Martin interviewed him on News One Now with Roland Martin when he was on TV One. And he's talking about how when the civil rights workers, he said when the civil rights workers came from the north and they go down south to Mississippi, he said when they first got down there, African Americans in Mississippi told them, we know you're nonviolent, but we're not. And we're not going to let these white people kill you. So it was African Americans with guns who were protecting the civil rights workers down there in Mississippi. This part of the history is totally left out of Eyes on the Prize. Now, there's some good stuff in Eyes on the Prize. I have the official DVD collection of Eyes on the Prize. I ordered from Amazon. Every Dr. King Day, every February, I go through and watch the whole thing. Okay? There's some good information. But this whole aspect of the armed resistance, the Deacons for Defense and Justice, Robert F. Williams and the Black Guard, this whole section of the history is totally left out of Eyes on the Prize. Okay? So it's clear that the people put together had an agenda. Now, there's still some good information in there, but you got to understand what's left out, right? So you can supplement it, you can augment it. So he said that if we go, it's on Amazon, so I'm not saying buy it from Amazon, buy the book, not saying buy it from Amazon, but if you can't find it at African American-owned bookstore, I understand. But if you go and look at it, right, it's called the name of the book is called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. They have an excerpt of the book here. It says, visiting Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. Montgomery bus boycott was December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956. Journalist William Worthy almost sat on a loaded pistol. Dr. King said, quote, just for self-defense, end quote. It was not the only weapon Dr. King kept for such a purpose. One of his advisors remembered the Reverend's Montgomery, Alabama home as, quote, an arsenal, end quote. Like Dr. King, many ostensibly nonviolent civil rights activists, many ostensibly, that means on the surface it gives the appearance, but that's not what it is. Many ostensibly nonviolent civil rights activists embrace their constitutional rights to self-protection, Second Amendment right. Yet this crucial dimension of the Afro-American freedom struggle has been long ignored by history. There's a reason why. In this nonviolent stuff that gets you killed, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. recovers this history, describing the vital role that armed self-defense has played in the survival and liberation of black communities. Drawing on his experiences in the civil rights movement and giving voice to its participants, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. lays bare the paradoxical relationship between the nonviolent civil rights struggle and the long history and importance of African Americans taking up arms to defend themselves against white supremacist violence. The Deacons for Defense and Justice oftentimes provided armed security for Dr. King. They provided armed security for civil rights workers. Probably the civil rights organization that used them the most was CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. The Deacons for Defense and Justice was founded July 10th, 1964 in Jonesboro, Louisiana by Ernest Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick. Okay, there's a big book, and I got it somewhere. I got 4 stacks of books next to me. I can't get to the book now, but I have the book on the Deacons for Defense and Justice, and there was a movie starring Forrest Whitaker. I think it was on Showtime, about the Deacons for Defense and Justice. That is part of civil rights history. But every Dr. King Day, and even usually during the month of February, African American History Month, they just get totally left out, like they don't even exist. If there had not been Negroes with guns, there would not have been a civil rights movement. Okay, so check that. I'll post a link here. This is to the book by Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. Now, the interview Roland Martin did is on YouTube. It's on Roland's YouTube channel. Then later that same day, Roland interviewed Professor Cobb Jr. for 2 hours on Roland's nationally syndicated radio show at the time. Because I used to guest host Roland's nationally syndicated radio show a lot. Okay, because I have the equipment here in the home. Some of it got to get repaired, but anyway. But I was doing nationally syndicated radio at the time. I had my show on the Empowerment Radio Network, and I was guest hosting his show as well. And for a time, I was guest hosting Warren Ballantyne's national radio show. All right, so this is some deep history that gets left out. And when the few times when I go and I'm at Dr. King Day celebration, stuff like that, that part is not talked about. 1956, Dr. King tried to get a concealed pistol license in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery is the capital of Alabama. This is during the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay? Dr. King's house was firebombed in January of 56. So that had to be January 29th of 56, because February 1st, probably January 30th, because 2 days later, February 1st, that's when the lawsuit of Browder versus Gale, Gayle, was filed. And that lawsuit goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's going to be that lawsuit that ends segregation on the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay? I just saw his book here. So people should read this book. Now, this is Dr. King's first book. It's called Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story. What is this book about? It's about the Montgomery bus boycott. So, I mean, because I talked to a lot of people, and people act like Dr. King didn't write books. He wrote 5. This was the first one. Came out in 1958. And it was in 1958 where he was stabbed with a letter opener, because he's at a book signing for his book. And Zola Ware Curry, I think was her name. It was a mentally deranged African-American woman. Stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. And there were 2 police officers who gave him aid who saved his life. One was African-American, one was white. And they told him, don't talk and don't sneeze. Okay? But definitely told him don't talk. There's a big article I read dealing with this. The 2 officers who saved his life. They're on the scene when he was stabbed in the chest with a letter opener. All right, how are we doing? Will, Eric, started the movement. Brother black soldiers returning from the war started the movement. Now, which movement are you referring to? If you're referring to World War II, when brothers come back home from World War II, yes, they're involved in activism, okay? And you have events that lead to the civil rights movement. But we can trace the civil rights movement going back to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porter boycotts. But when we talk about World War II veterans in the civil rights movement, one of them was Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was a field secretary for the NAACP in Jackson, Mississippi. So in 2019, June 6, 2019, people commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. 155,000 Allied soldiers land in Normandy, France. There were almost 2,000 African-American soldiers who were part of that 155,000. Medgar Evers was one of them. He was a World War II veteran. And when he comes back home, he gets involved in what's going to become the civil rights movement. So a lot of times when we talk about this history, we leave Medgar Evers out. Medgar Evers has to be included in that. Medgar Evers owned guns too. He wasn't stupid. Okay? Medgar Evers owned guns as well. All right. How's everybody doing? Everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in. This type of information you're not going to hear a lot of other places. Okay? Follow us on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. Follow us on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. So the founder of the African History Network hosts the African History Network show. All right, so let's continue here. All right, let's see here. All right, so Dr. King and the Scripto Pen Factory. So though it was a remarkably humble gesture for someone who had received such a lofty affirmation, Dr. King's actions that day and his call for a nationwide boycott of Scripto products won him few friends in his hometown's white, staunchly anti-union business community. All right. If you watch the point I was getting to, the third installment of Eyes on the Prize, 1960 to 61, is called Ain't Scared of Your Jails. It deals with the Nashville, Tennessee economic boycott of the downtown business district. The Nashville, Tennessee, it was an Easter boycott. It was about March, April, 1960. African Americans were trying to break the back of segregation in Nashville, Tennessee. The movement was largely led by African American college students, because there were four colleges, there were four HBCUs, I think it was, there in the Nashville area. So they're having sit-ins, and they had sit-ins, and they had economic boycotts of the downtown business district. And what they did was, the boycotts spread to about 59 cities across the country. They spread up north. So African Americans up north were boycotting the Woolworths and the Kresge's, those chain stores that their brothers and sisters were boycotting in the South, in Nashville, Tennessee. We were boycotting up north to be in solidarity with them. This is in 1960, before Twitter, before Facebook, before Instagram, before TikTok, before text messages, before cell phones and emails. They were organized like this. And what they did was they ended segregation in the downtown business district in Nashville, Tennessee. But they understood just having an economic boycott locally is not what's going to have the biggest impact. You have to do it nationally. Targeted, sustained economic withdrawal strategies. So, Dr. King's picketing also foreshadowed a future in which Dr. King would move beyond the bloody battles against blatantly illegal state and local racial practices in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and Selma. Not content with the gains registered in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We know the Voting Rights Act of 65 is weakened now because it was attacked by the lawsuit of Shelby County versus Holder, U.S. Supreme Court case in 2015, which gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So, not content with the gains registered in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. King resolved to pursue a more expansive, aggressive, and, to white Americans especially, unsettling socioeconomic and political agenda, one that would draw him into another fateful labor dispute some 3.5 years later in Memphis, Tennessee, where he ended up being assassinated April 4th, 1968. While still involved in the Scripto Pen Factory affair, Dr. King sat down for an interview with Playboy magazine. The interview was conducted by Alex Haley, who wrote Roots. In this interview, Dr. King endorsed a massive federal aid program for African Americans. A massive federal aid program for African Americans. Its whopping $50 billion price tag was, as he pointed out, less than the annual U.S. spending on defense. Such an expenditure, Dr. King argued, would be more than justified in a spectacular decline in, quote, school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils, end quote. Now, many poor whites were, quote, in the very same boat with the Negro, Dr. King added. And if they could be persuaded to join forces with African Americans, they could form, quote, a grand alliance, end quote, and exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all. So if we look at his letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963, I think it was April 1963. And he's in the, this is during the Birmingham campaign, 1963. They're trying to break the back of segregation. And he's in jail for 8 days. He writes a letter from the Birmingham jail around the margins of a newspaper, because that's the only thing he had to write with, to write on. And, he asked the guards, the jail guards there, he asked them, how much, do you make doing this job? And they tell him. And he says, well, hell, you should be out here marching with us. Because what he was explaining to them is the same system that we're fighting against is the same system actually oppressing you. But because you think you're part of the system, you fight to uphold the system to keep us from getting what we're trying to achieve. But us getting what we're trying to achieve also benefits you as well. This is what he was explaining to them. So then 67, 68, you have the Poor People's Campaign, which was a massive movement of poor people across the country, not just African Americans, but poor white people as well. Because he understood, and I'm going to play an excerpt of the interview that NBC News did with Dr. King May 8th, 1967. A little less than, it was 11 months before he was assassinated. He talked about how, because of the Vietnam War, well, first of all, Dr. King was a humanitarian, so he's against the oppression of anybody, okay? So, number one. But he talked about how, because of the Vietnam War and the attention that the news media was giving to the Vietnam War, it was very hard to get the issues pertaining to African Americans addressed. He talked about how incidents pertaining to African Americans that would have been front page news now are on page 16. And when we look at the Poor People's Campaign, is looking at, he understood you got to galvanize to be able to get something accomplished in that environment with the Vietnam War. You're going to have something massive, and it's not just going to be African Americans involved. And this was the Poor People's Campaign. We see that Reverend William Barber III and others have rejuvenated the Poor People's Campaign. Because when we talk about health care, we ain't just, you got a lot of poor white people who vote Republican who don't have health care, or their health care is being threatened by Donald Trump and Republicans. So a lot of these same issues that we're dealing with today, dealing with poor people or people who are almost poor or about to be poor, it's dealing with people across racial lines. This is what Dr. King was explaining back then. So many poor whites, in the, Dr. King explained, were in the very same boat with the Negro. He added, and if they could be persuaded to join forces with blacks, they could form, quote, a grand alliance, end quote, and exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all, end quote. So Dr. King had made passing allusions to this possibility before, but a straightforward call for an active biracial coalition of have-nots was just as terrifying to white ruling elites, be they on Peachtree Street, like Peachtree Streets in Atlanta, or Wall Street, as it had been when raised by the populace in the 1890s. So Dr. King did nothing to quell these concerns when he later told David Halberstam that he had abandoned the incremental approach to social change of his civil rights protest days in favor of pursuing, quote, a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values, a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values, end quote. One which would, quote, look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation, end quote. So from 66 to 68, Dr. King transitions from civil rights to human rights and broadens the fight, broadens the focus. He transitions from civil rights to human rights. Now, he always dealt and talked about economics. He didn't just start talking about economics the day before he was assassinated. But you have this transition taking place because you have the Civil Rights Act of 64, July 2nd, 1964, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. You have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, August 6, 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. You have Executive Order 11246, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, September 1965. We call that affirmative action. That's Executive Order 11246. So he's progressing to the next level. So Dr. King's vision of a revolution in values was not purely domestic. In April of 1967, 1 year before he was assassinated, Dr. King announced American involvement in Vietnam. Once at his own, he denounced American involvement in Vietnam once at his own Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and once at Riverside Church in New York before 3,000 people on April 4th, precisely a year before he was killed. So that's the speech entitled Beyond Vietnam. So that's the speech where he officially comes out, and that's the first speech he gives, officially coming out in opposition to the Vietnam War, Beyond Vietnam. Okay? Overnight, he becomes the most hated man in America. Overnight, he becomes the most hated man in America. Okay? So it's important for us to understand this chronology. All right, now I've got to pull up, let me pull up, I'm going to pull up a video clip. We're going to go to 2 clips here. Just 1 second here. Okay, that's it right there. All right, so April 4th, 1967, precisely 1 year before Dr. King was assassinated, he delivers this speech Beyond Vietnam. Dr. King decried the hypocrisy of sending young black men, quote, 8,000 miles to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem. Beyond that lay the painful irony of seeing them join white soldiers with whom they could, quote, hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta, end quote, in brutal solidarity as they torched the huts of a poor village. In this, they were, however, unwittingly agents of a U.S. policy that destroyed and depopulated the countryside, forcing its former inhabitants to take refuge in cities teeming with, quote, hundreds of thousands of homeless children, end quote, who were running in packs on the streets like animals. This is Dr. King. See, this is Dr. King Republicans don't want to quote. This is Dr. King a lot of black people don't quote. When they had these corporate funded Dr. King Day celebrations and everybody's eating sandwiches with the crust cut off and things like this, they don't deal with this revolutionary Dr. King. All right, so March 30th, 1967, there was a interview done with Dr. King and Muhammad Ali. And they were talking about being in opposition to the Vietnam War. A lot of people are not familiar with this. Dr. King and Muhammad Ali had a secret friendship, okay? And biography.com has a really good article dealing with this. Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali's surprising secret friendship. In public, the men were diametrically opposed. In private, they identified with one another. All right, so at this point, these are probably the two most recognizable African-American men in the country. Malcolm X was assassinated February 21st, 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom. So you have Dr. King and Muhammad Ali, okay? So let me turn up the volume. Let's go to this clip here.
What did you discuss back in the hotel room?
Nothing, just friends, just like Khrushchev and Kennedy and everybody. When the people, all of the politicians of all other white races come together, and they, although they believe different, they think different, whites can come together and discuss the common cause. But whenever a few of us come together, the world is shook up. And I say, whatever went back there, it's our business.
Reverend King, do you agree?
Oh, yes. We had a very good discussion on many matters. And, of course, these are not things that we would discuss here. But we do have common problems and common concerns. And above all, as Muhammad Ali has just said, we are all victims of the same system of oppression. And even though we may have different religious beliefs, this does not at all bring about a difference in terms of our concerns.
Still brothers.
Do you share the same, one more question, do you share the same concern that Muhammad has for his draft status?
Oh, I certainly do. My views on the draft are very clear. I'm against it. And I think the sooner our country does away with the draft, the better it will be for everybody. I'm very disturbed about the militaristic posture of our nation. And I think until we have a radical reordering of priorities in our country, we are going more and more to the depths and, I should say, to the doom that follows arrogance of power, as Senator Fulbright said.
Okay, so that is from March 30th, 1967, courtesy of the Associated Press. And you heard Muhammad Ali said, we're still brothers. He put his arm around Dr. King and he said, we're still brothers. So even though he's a Baptist minister, I'm a minister in the Nation of Islam, even though we have some differences, we're still brothers. We're still, in general, trying to get to the same place. We may have different tactics. I'm trying to basically get to the same place. But this is what he's explaining. So the next month, so that was March 30th, 1967. So the next month, Dr. King, April 4th, 1967, delivers Beyond Vietnam. He comes out officially in opposition to the Vietnam War. He delivers his first speech in opposition to the Vietnam War. And then later in April 30th, 1967, Muhammad Ali goes to the draft board but refuses to take the step forward to be drafted into the Army. All right, so both of those occurrences happened in April of 1967. the month after that interview took place. All right, so that was a pivotal time in America, and that was pivotal to the anti-war effort. All right, that gave a real boost to those African Americans and white people who were against the Vietnam War. And you had a lot of people like Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, a lot of African American activists who were encouraging Dr. King to publicly come out in opposition to the Vietnam War, because they said, they're sending us over here, we're getting over there, we're getting killed, and you got to come out in opposition. There were black civil rights leaders and civil rights activists, things like this, telling him, don't come out in opposition. Okay, so Dr. King is stuck in the middle, but he operated based upon principle. Okay, not based upon what was popular. He operated based upon what was based upon principle. Okay, so former student nonviolent coordinating committee chairman Stokely Carmichael observed that in this case, Dr. King was taking on not a hapless, wholly unsympathetic villain like Birmingham's Sheriff Eugene Bull Connor, but rather, quote, the entire policy of the United States government, end quote. He's talking about Dr. King coming out in opposition to the Vietnam War. The consequences were swift and severe. An outraged President Lyndon Johnson cut off all contact with Dr. King. This is the day after he gives that speech. It's April 4th, 1967. Overnight, he becomes the most hated man in America. And a great number of African Americans, including many old allies and colleagues from the civil rights years, warned that Dr. King's stance could have devastating consequences for their cause. So, if we look at this interview from May 8th, 1967, this was done by NBC News, okay? How's everybody doing? Everybody share this broadcast on social media pages. Invite your friends to tune in also. Who we have here? Danita, Eric, Paula, Allison. Just a few of the people watching. This next clip I'm going to go to, this is from May 8th, 1967. This is an interview NBC News did at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. This was Dr. King's church in Atlanta, okay? His father was the pastor. And this is about 11 months before he's assassinated, and he's talking about a new phase of the civil rights struggle. New phase, and he's talking about black power, okay? And let's see, we'll go to that here. And then also, African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Email us at customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Customer service at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. Whether you have a brick or mortar store, e-commerce store. Current promotion: buy 1 month, get 2 months free. And also, we take your promote your business in our Facebook Live broadcast, but also in our audio podcast of our weekly broadcast and our Sunday night show as well. So we're on 8 different audio podcast platforms. Okay, and then we have people in Georgetown, Guyana, who are watching us also. How you doing, Brian, in Georgetown, Guyana? Okay, so let's go to this clip here. And then it's this clip was originally called. So this interview took place on May 8, 1967, at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was aired as part of a special report on NBC News called "After Civil Rights, Black Power." After Civil Rights, Black Power.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Was there, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I'll put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Whereas in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair, and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win. And it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
In the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains. Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Okay, so let me pause it right there. All right, so he said a lot right there. And what Dr. King was talking about was the difference between fighting in the South and fighting in the North. And you had, and this is what Stokely Carmichael was saying, Kwame Ture, in the article from Smithsonian Mag I was talking about, where Kwame Ture observed that in this case, in opposition to the Vietnam War, Dr. King was taking on not a hapless, wholly unsympathetic villain like Birmingham Sheriff Eugene Bull Connor, but rather the entire policy of the United States government. The consequences were swift. But when they had the protests and Bloody Sunday in March 7th, 1965, trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when you have these confrontations, these are being shown on CBS, NBC, ABC, and it's shocking a nation because you have a clear opponent. But up north, the white supremacy and racism, you didn't have the colored only, for the most part, the colored only signs and things like this. So your opponent is not as clear. It's more systemic. Okay, so it's harder up north to galvanize people around a target that's harder for them to see and harder for them to hit. This is the difference. These are the nuances of white supremacy and racism that you're seeing in the North and the South. It still exists up north, but it's more subtle. So he talked about nonviolence. Now we already know Dr. King owned guns. It was Bayard Rustin who talked him into getting rid of his guns. Because Bayard Rustin, he came over one day with a reporter. The reporter almost sat on one of his guns. Bayard Rustin has a long conversation. They talk for hours about the nonviolent movement, because this is during the Montgomery bus boycott. They talk about nonviolent movement, and Bayard Rustin says that if something happens, because Dr. King was getting death threats, his house was firebombed, things like this, and there were other firebombings taking place. E.D. Nixon's house was firebombed. E.D. Nixon was a president of a local chapter of the NAACP. He helped organize the Montgomery bus boycott. His house was firebombed. Rosa Parks was getting death threats, all types of things like this. So Bayard Rustin is saying, if somebody tries to attack you or your family, and in self-defense, you shoot and kill them or shoot them, right? This could derail this nonviolent movement, okay? So Dr. King ends up getting rid of his guns because of this. But still, he's going to have people around him who are doing protection for him, for civil rights workers, things like this, who are armed. Later, you're going to have 1964 Deacons for Defense and Justice that are formed. They're periodically going to do protection for him as well. So if we dig deeper into this, because we're looking at something that ostensibly looks like a nonviolent movement, but as Professor James Small personally told me, and then when you do research, you find out the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. On the surface, it was a nonviolent movement. As I explained on my show Sunday night, there was a reason why most slaves ran away at nighttime and not in the daytime. There was a reason why most slaves ran away at nighttime, not in the daytime. They didn't have PhDs, but they weren't dumb. They knew they had a better chance of staying gone and escaping if they ran away at nighttime under the cover of night. Okay? Now, before they left, most likely they didn't go knock on the slave master's door and say, "It's been nice knowing you. We're about to leave. We just want to say goodbye." No, they just left in the cover of night. So if we look at this article from WashingtonPost.com, Washington Post, this is by Professor Nicholas Johnson. He was a guest blogger for the Washington Post. This article is from January 31st, 2014. Professor Nicholas Johnson is the author of the book Negroes and the Gun. Negroes and the Gun, the Black Tradition of Arms. The name of this article is Nonviolent Winchesters and the Fine Art of Concealed Carry in the Modern Civil Rights Movement. Nonviolent Winchesters and the Fine Art of Concealed Carry in the Modern Civil Rights Movement. So in the article, it talks about, he says, the longest chapter in the book, Negroes and the Gun, is devoted to the modern civil rights movement. The record here is rich with oral histories, memories, and other detailed first-hand accounts that illuminated the black tradition of arms. Local lore in Columbia, Tennessee, says that in 1946, armed Negroes were a break, B-R-A-K-E, on plans to lynch Thurgood Marshall. The prodigiously armed T.R.M. Howard, those his initials, T.R.M. T.R.M. Howard and the surrounding black community were central in the quest for justice for Emmett Till. In 1956, Constance Baker Motley, who's going to go on to become the first African-American female federal judge, Constance Baker Motley. In 1956, Constance Baker Motley and Thurgood Marshall were guarded by armed black men overnight and on the way to the courthouse when they were in Birmingham, Alabama to press desegregation cases. See, stuff like this is just totally left out in general the civil rights movement, and it's totally left out of Eyes on the Prize. They just make you think people just had Bibles and were singing Negro spirituals, things like that. No, these people weren't stupid. Rosa Parks recounts vividly a table filled with guns as she and her husband Raymond Parks started hosting activist meetings at their house on Huffman Street, there in Montgomery, Alabama. And Raymond Parks' gun was a comfort when harassment began. Legendary civil rights activist, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, rode to the rescue when a 15-car caravan, with a 15-car caravan of armed black men, when Freedom Riders, civil rights, the Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who are riding on the buses, the Greyhound buses, to desegregate the interstate transportation. These are the Freedom Riders, okay? And you have Freedom Summer 1964, Freedom Summer. Legendary activist, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, rode to the rescue with a 15-car caravan of armed black men when Freedom Riders were menaced by a crowd in Anniston. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth's good friend, Reverend Ed Gardner, would later capture the dichotomy that undergirded the movement in a quip about his, quote, nonviolent Winchester, end quote. His nonviolent Winchester. So a Winchester is an old manufacturer of firearms, especially during the Old West. In the Winchester, most they made lever action rifles. Okay, so you watch like the Riflemen starring Chuck Connors. You watch a lot of old westerns. They have the lever action rifles like a 30-30. Okay, the Winchester Gun Company manufactured a lot of those. Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice was just a child at the time, but vividly reconstructs the scene of her father and the men of Dynamite Hill in Birmingham, Alabama, organizing an armed watch to deter bomb throwers. So when you study Birmingham, Alabama during the Civil Rights era, they were bombing so many African Americans' houses and homes and schools, things like this, businesses, that African Americans called Birmingham Bombingham. And when you watch Eyes on the Prize, they talk about this. There's a you can probably find some clips of Eyes, or you can find Eyes on the Prize. Probably it may still be on YouTube. Sometimes they take it down, but you can search for it. Now, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in 1963 contacts Dr. King and asks Dr. King to come to Birmingham, Alabama, to help them break the back of segregation in Birmingham. And he tells him, if you come to Birmingham, we can guarantee you a victory, because nonviolent direct action is being challenged at this time, because the civil rights movement, Dr. King and the civil rights movement suffered a defeat with the Albany campaign in Albany, Georgia in 1961 and 1962. Okay, they were not successful in breaking the back of segregation in Albany, Georgia. All right, so he's looking for a victory. So Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth says, you come to Birmingham, I can guarantee you a victory here. All right, and this is another point of the civil rights movement, because it's projected as Dr. King was the leader of the civil rights movement. He was not the leader of the civil rights movement. There was no one leader of the civil rights movement. You had national organizations, NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. Then you had local activists. Okay, Reverend Fred. So the Birmingham campaign, that movement in Birmingham had already started before Dr. King got involved in it. When they tell this history, when they tell this revisionist history, it makes it seem like all this stuff just revolved around Dr. King, and they weren't doing anything till Dr. King came to town. That's not true. Daisy Bates, who shepherded the Little Rock Nine in Little Rock, Arkansas, through the integration and desegregation struggle of Central High School there in Little Rock, Arkansas. She offered a rich record of the culture of arms. Correspondence with Thurgood Marshall confirms that Daisy Bates kept Old Betsy at the ready. Her memoir shows that she often carried a gun and once actually fired on a seething little man who launched a firebomb at her home. Our eye is drawn to the famous names, but we are lucky that the surviving record is rich with unheralded characters. Some of these people deserve monuments, but we barely know them. Over time, one hopes their names will rise in our culture, and people will recognize the images and appreciate the steel, S-T-E-E-L, the steel in the eyes of women like Winston Hudson, Leola Blackman, Aura Bryant, Jackie Hicks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and the even deeper lineup of the sober, mature black men who embraced armed self-defense as a crucial private resource. These people not only owned guns and fired them in self-defense, they also carry guns in defiance of discretionary permitting schemes of the type that said a bombing at Martin Luther King's home did not constitute good cause for granting him a permit to carry a gun. Because see, in 1956, Dr. King tried to get a concealed pistol license. When I watch the television and they talk about Dr. King, I don't hear people talk about that. Now, I heard Joanne Reed talk about this on MSNBC. But this is very few people talk about that. I don't hear any white people talk about that. The NRA will try to co-opt that, but they distort his legacy, and they usually don't support African Americans who are arrested, just like the case of Philando Castile in Minnesota. Philando Castile was a licensed, he had a CPL, he had a concealed pistol license. It took the NRA almost a year to come out in support of Philando Castile, exercising his Second Amendment right. Okay, and we know with the Munford Act in 68, 69 with the Black Panther Party for self-defense, the NRA sides with the state of California to take away the rights of people in California to open carry, because the Black Panther Party for self-defense, they were studying law. And in the state of California, it was legal for you to open carry. If you legally owned a gun, whether it's a rifle or a pistol, you can open carry. Okay? That means you can walk down the street, openly have your gun. It can't be hidden under a jacket. That's concealed. All right? History.com, which is the official website of the History Channel, has an article from 2018. The NRA supported gun control when the Black Panthers had the weapons. The NRA supported gun control when the Black Panthers had the weapons. Back in the 1960s, even the NRA supported gun control to disarm the group. Okay? So read this. So it was 1967. 1967. The bill took California down the path to having some of the strictest gun laws in America and helped jumpstart a surge of national gun control restrictions. All right. It talks about, let's see, in 1967, 30 members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense protested on the steps of the California State House armed with .357 Magnums, 12-gauge shotguns, and 40 caliber pistols, and announced, quote, "The time has come for black people to arm themselves," end quote. The display so frightened politicians, including California Governor Ronald Reagan, who became president, that it helped to pass the Mulford Act, M-U-L-F-O-R-D, the Mulford Act, a state bill prohibiting the open carry of loaded firearms, along with an addendum prohibiting loaded firearms in the state capitol. The 1967 bill took California down the path to having some of the strictest gun laws in America and helped jumpstart a surge of national gun control restrictions. So I'm going to post this link here. Read that entire article. That's from history.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. Okay, how you doing? Ernest, Danita, PBS would normally show it. PBS would normally show what? Now, probably during February, you'll see PBS, they'll show Eyes on the Prize. Okay? Watch it. Okay? But understand, I'm not saying don't watch Eyes on the Prize. Okay? But understand what's left out and why it's being left out of that story. There's some good information in Eyes on the Prize. That's why, I ordered it. And you can probably get it, probably at least watch some of it on YouTube. All right? All right, so let's see here. Okay, African American business owners, post the name of your business here in the thread of the broadcast. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. Okay, so we have a few new advertisers. Now we have a few spots left. Okay, current promotion: buy 1 month, get 2 months free. It's 2020. A lot of people want to get their financial house in order, and certified financial planner Martisha Patterson can help you do this. She has over 25 years in the wealth management industry, and she will help you apply proven tools, techniques, and strategies so you can meet your financial goals. A lot of people want to get their credit in order, they want to buy a home, etc. Certified financial planner Martisha Patterson can help you do this and help you get control of your finances and build wealth over time. Give her a call, area code 646-552-4384, 646-552-4384 for a free consultation, or visit her website, pattersonplans, the number 17.com, pattersonplans17.com, for more information and to get in contact with her as well. Author Teresa Roseman is the author of the book She Remembered Her Path. She Remembered Her Path. And this book is about a woman named Sheteria who finds herself in trouble. Sheteria feels she cannot make decisions that were simple in her younger life. The fear is she has stepped off the path she has created and now needs guidance to return to her self-confidence. Find out what happens to Sheteria in the book She Remembered Her Path, which is available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, eBay, and also in Kindle format at Amazon.com by author Teresa Roseman. Okay, so let's continue here. Okay, Eric, Phillip, how's everybody doing? Ernest in California. And you can share this information with your children as well, okay? So I try to keep it clean, a bunch of cursing, it's not vulgar, so you can share this with your children. And, you know, a lot of, I hear from a lot of older people, and they say they appreciate that as well, okay? All right, let's continue here. And then we also have at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, we have as a 2.5-hour lecture I did, The Distortion of the Legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Revolutionary would not be televised on this on the television. So we have it in DVD format and digital download format. We just posted the link here also. All right, let's go back to the article here from SmithsonianMag.com. that was talking about. Even though he is revered today, MLK was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. Even though he is revered today, MLK was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. So Dr. King hardly fared better in pursuing his domestic agenda. It was one thing to capture public sympathy nationwide when pitted against the raw hatred and brutality that seemed the peculiar province of whites below the Mason-Dixon line. It proved quite another to persuade whites outside the South to share their neighborhoods and jobs with African Americans, or to support expensive federal assistance programs dedicated to helping African Americans overcome the historic disadvantages imposed on them by whites of earlier generations. This sounds like the whole fight dealing with reparations right now, in opposition to reparations. Okay? So what this is saying is, when they were fighting to sit on the bus, when they were fighting, when they were having sit-ins at lunch counters, when they're fighting against discrimination, shopping in the downtown business district, and not being able to try on clothes in white-owned establishments, things like this, they faced a certain type of opposition. But now when you talk about economic investment in the African American community to correct historical inequities, Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, they faced even more opposition from many white people. Some of them were some of the ones who supported desegregation, or maybe even possibly supported desegregation of the schools. You're dealing with a whole nother level of opposition when you're talking about economics. Dr. King fared better in pursuing his domestic agenda. It was one thing to capture public sympathy nationwide when pitted against the raw hatred and brutality that seemed the peculiar province of whites below the Mason-Dixon line, fighting against Bull Connor, getting the dog sicked on you, getting the water hoses turned on you in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is being shown on the TV across the country and shocking a nation, okay? Seeing African Americans being beaten by the state troopers on Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. And John Lewis is there and gets hit in the head. He almost dies, okay? That shocks a nation and helps to push for the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But now you're talking about economic investment. Now that's something different. It proved quite another to persuade whites outside the South to share their neighborhoods and jobs with African Americans, or to support expensive federal assistance programs dedicated to helping African Americans overcome the historic disadvantages imposed on them by whites of earlier generations. So if we look at the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder, 1967, July 28, 1967, called the Kerner Commission. If you go to blackpast.org, they have a good write-up on the Kerner Commission. And this commission was convened the day after the 1967 Detroit Rebellion ended. It ended July 27th, 1967. July 28th, 1967, President Lyndon Baines Johnson convenes the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Okay? It was an 11-member commission. The chairman was Governor Otto Kerner of the state of Illinois. President Johnson wanted the commission to answer 3 questions. What happened when it came to the eruption in cities between 1964 and 1967? In 1967 was known as the Long Hot Summer. In 1967, there were 159 violent uprisings across the country. Okay? All of them were not on the level of a Newark, New Jersey or Detroit. There's an article from USA Today called The Long Hot Summer, and it deals with the rebellion in Newark, New Jersey. But President Johnson wanted this 11-member commission to find out what happened with the rebellions, why did it happen, and what could be done to prevent racial disturbance in the future. In order to answer these questions, the commission surveyed 23 cities across the nation which experienced a racial rebellion. The Kerner Commission found that the racial disturbances were not the result of a single triggering event. Because, see, this is the difference between a riot and a rebellion. So some people ask me, well, what's the difference between a riot and a rebellion, Michael Imhotep? And I say a rebellion is a response to a system of white supremacy and racism. A rebellion, okay, now I'm not saying people should be out in the street burning down houses and things, burning down businesses, things like this. What I'm talking about is a rebellion is the language of the unheard. It's a response to a system of oppression that's being inflicted upon you. A riot is what white college students have when they lose an NCAA championship, or they lose a college football championship, and they're out in the streets turning over cars and setting things on fire. That's a riot. That's not because of a system of oppression. That's because they lost a game. That's a riot. A rebellion is what took place in Newark, New Jersey, what took place in Detroit, Michigan. Those are rebellions. They're rebelling against a system. It's not an individual event. They try to make it seem like it was an individual event. Police officer shot somebody, stopped somebody, now they're going crazy. No, that is rebelling against historic inequities and a system of oppression being inflicted upon the people. So they found that the racial disturbances were not the result of a single triggering event, but that in all cities surveyed, there was 23 cities surveyed, African Americans experienced severe economic and social disadvantages compared to whites. Also, the Kerner Commission report noted that the riots were not the result of any conspiracy. Rather, they were a response to what the report identified as the racial attitudes and behaviors of white Americans toward African Americans. The report noted that the riots were not the result of any conspiracy. The rebellions, they call it riots here, but these were rebellions. The rebellions were rather a response to what the report identified as the racial attitudes and behaviors of white Americans to African Americans. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, resources, benefits, privileges, land, access to education, access to opportunity, health care, jobs, etc. And they use that to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. This is what racism is, okay? I'm not saying all white people believe that or buy into that. I'm talking about a system of racism, what this is, okay? Answering what can be done to prevent this in the future. The Kerner Commission suggested that the federal government intervene to improve housing, improve education, improve employment opportunities, and social services for African Americans. The Kerner Commission was almost all, I think there's one African American on the Kerner Commission. All the rest of them are white. This is what they said after their survey. We have to revisit the findings of the Kerner Commission because President Johnson put this to the side, disagreed with some of their findings, but at the same time, he's dealing with the Vietnam War. We got to revisit this because they already did the research and came to the conclusion. Answering what can be done to prevent this in the future, the Kerner Commission suggested that the federal government intervene to improve housing, education, employment opportunities, and social services for African Americans. Also, to dismantle discriminatory practices in education, employment, the police force, and criminal court systems. President Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Executive Order 11246, September 1965, which is affirmative action. He's going to sign Medicare and Medicaid in 1968. He signs the Fair Housing Act of 1968. President Johnson accepted the report, but did not support the conclusions. And minimal efforts were made to address the problem identified by the Kerner Commission. We need to revisit that because they already did the research and they came to the conclusion. So the lack of interest and dedication to investment to correct these historical inequities is the same thing that's being talked about and has been talked about for decades dealing with the reparations movement. But here, they have the evidence right here in this Kerner Commission report. We have to talk about that. We have to, because that is something that when we talk about putting together a black agenda and you get buy-in from various organizations across the country, this is what they did in August of 2013. People need to go back and look at August of 2013 when 60 civil rights organizations presented a black agenda to President Barack Obama. Now, they should have done it in the first term, beginning of the first term. They didn't do it beginning of the first term, but they did it August 2013. It was about 35, 36 pages, something like this, right? And it is, let me see, I'll give you the name of it so you can read it, okay? I forgot the name of it, but I have it here. I'll pull that up. But, okay, yeah, here we go. August 23rd, 2013. It's entitled 21st Century Agenda for Jobs and Freedom. 21st Century Agenda for Jobs and Freedom. African American leaders convening national policy priorities. August 23rd, 2013. Okay, and they talk about achieving economic parity for African Americans, promote equity and educational opportunity, protect and defend voting rights, promote a healthier nation by eliminating healthcare disparities, achieve comprehensive criminal justice reform. That's just a brief overview. The ensuing discussions and debates resulted in the identification of 5 urgent domestic goals for the nation. Okay, so I'm going to post this link here. This came from Crew of 42. That's the website that has this, crewof42.com. But you can read this. A lot of people don't even know this exists. Then we know in March of 2017, the executive leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus presented a 125-page agenda to the Trump administration entitled "We Have a Lot to Lose: 21st Century Solutions for Black Families," which is pretty good, actually. I went through and read it. A lot of people don't know it exists. It's at cbc.house.gov. cbc.house.gov. We have a lot. You can read cbc.house.gov is the official website of the Congressional Black Caucus. And one of the good things about the report, and I have it in my backpack because I carry it around with me, is that first thing they do on page 8 is lay out history of what happened to African Americans. So they lay out history, then they lay out a number of different issues in the African American community. Then they have legislation. The third part deals with legislation to address the issues. This is legislation that needs to be pushed and passed through the House and the Senate and signed into law. Okay, yeah, here we go. Yeah, we have a lot to lose, and here's the link for that also. It's at cbc.house.gov. Here we go. So I downloaded it, took it to the printer, got it printed up, because I wouldn't print up 125 pages here. That's a lot of ink. All right, let's continue. Okay, so that was the Kerner Commission report. All right, let's go back to the article from SmithsonianMag.com. All right, so Dr. King had a better grasp of what he was up against after his 1966 open housing campaign in and around Chicago, where he confronted white mobs he described as more hateful than any he had seen, quote, even in Mississippi or Alabama, end quote. In this context, his own stern insistence on strict adherence to the doctrine of nonviolence met with growing disdain among a younger generation of black leaders, tired of relying on the slow process of peaceful protest and tedious negotiation. Some mocked Dr. King's ministerial oratory and called him Delawd, okay, or Delawd. It's a degradation of the Lord, okay, D-E-L-A-W-D. It was impatience with Dr. King's doctrine of nonviolence that turned what would prove to be his last march on behalf of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee on March 28, 1968 into a riot. Some marchers quickly broke ranks to break store windows, and looting was soon underway. An aggressive police response, complete with tear gas and billy clubs, led some protesters to retaliate with Molotov cocktails. By the end of the confrontation, one person was dead and some 50 others wounded. Feeling repudiated and ashamed by this failure to prevent violence, Dr. King had to be pressured into returning to Memphis, Tennessee a week later for yet another march. And he was trying to prove that nonviolence would work. He was trying to prove that they could have another march that was successful without the violence, without breaking out into rebellion and things like this. And he's going to be assassinated April 4th, 1968. All right. So you can check out the rest of this article here, and it goes on to say when Stokely Carmichael originally scheduled a press conference for April 5th, 1968, he had planned, so the day after Dr. King was assassinated, he had planned to use it as a platform for demanding the release of fellow black militant H. Rap Brown, who had been stuck in a Maryland jail for several weeks. Instead, he devoted, Stokely Carmichael, devoted but a few sentences to the plight of Brother Rap, quote unquote, Brother Rap, before declaring that, quote, white America made its biggest mistake last night, end quote, by killing Dr. Martin Luther King. All right, because Kwame Ture and Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King were friends. They had disagreements on tactics. The younger generation usually feels that things are moving. They always feel things are moving too slowly. The older generation is usually more prudent and understand that things take time. The younger generation is usually saying things are moving too slowly. This is the same thing back then in the 60s. Okay, so check out this article. Even though he is revered today, MLK was widely disliked by the American public when he was killed. Okay, so that's from SmithsonianMag.com. Now I got about, I don't know, 20 articles. I ain't gonna be able to get through all this stuff. I'm telling you right now. So we're gonna look at a couple more things and call it a night. Let me go back to this interview with Dr. King from May 8th, 1967. This was done by NBC News. And a lot of people are not familiar with this. Just a second here. Let's flip back over. All right. So how's everybody doing? Are you all learning anything? Okay. We still have some people watching us. Flyonisha. How you doing, Flyonitia? I should say Angela. Like now, young folks is not dealing with peaceful protests. Well, some of no, a lot of them are. There's a lot of frustration. A lot of times people lack an understanding of history and lack strategy and don't understand targeted sustained economic withdrawal strategies. That's a huge weapon. We don't understand that. So people will operate out of frustration. Okay? I mean, when was the time there was a nationwide economic boycott of a corporation or something like that? Okay? So, and then, you know, last time African Americans, they definitely weren't boycotting Popeyes. The sodium-filled Popeyes chicken sandwich, definitely weren't boycotting that. Last time there was a mass boycott of African Americans against something that was probably in protest of Colin Kaepernick, and that didn't last very long. Look at what's happening now. People gonna watch the Super Bowl. I don't know. I haven't watched the NFL game in going on 4 years. Yeah, Colin Kaepernick still blackballed. I don't care about the settlement. He didn't get hired by a team. He's still being blackballed. He's still making an example out of. So why should I watch a game? Okay, we got Eric, Toya. How you doing, Toya? All right, so let's go back to this clip here. This is from May 8th, 1967. NBCNews.com interviewed Dr. King 11 months before he was assassinated. And also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, $, the AHN show, through Cash App, because we have Cash App now. People are asking us to get Cash App. And then also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN show. And at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, click on the yellow donate button. All right. If you want to set up for a recurring donation, you can do that also. It really helps us to keep doing the research, finance our Sunday night show, keep doing the broadcast, pay the bills, etc. Okay, Ernest. How you doing, Ernest? Okay, let's go back to this clip here. Let me turn this up. Just the volume.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger? And then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even 65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Okay, so I'm going to back that up. I'm going to play it again. Because, see, what he just said, when Republicans quote Dr. King, they don't talk about that. You can't laud Dr. King. You can't hold up Dr. King and deny people a living wage. You can't hold up Dr. King and then try to take away health care from people. That's a contradiction. Just keep your mouth shut about Dr. King. Because if you go look at, so for instance, right, this article, because I have thousands of articles on all different topics. This is just one. This is one. This is not all on Dr. King, of course, but I do research like 6 or 10 hours a day. This is one file folder. I have 2 crates full of file folders. That's one file folder. This is another blue file folder with more research. This is what I do. Okay, I teach, but I need to know what the hell I'm talking about. Right? Okay, so this is what he just said. This is what a lot of people don't want to deal with. See, they want to talk about Dr. King wanted everybody to love everybody and things like this. Dr. King was talking about a redistribution of resources. He was talking about a radical change in values, etc. And this gets into why the Kerner Commission report that called for, and this is at blackpast.org, blackpast.org. I've read tons of their articles. They have about 6,000 pages of articles dealing with African American history specifically, and then some African history. The Kerner Commission report called for an investment into the African American communities. The report in response to why the rebellions occurred, the rebellions from 1964 to 1967, the Kerner Commission report pointed to Black America's frustration and feelings of powerlessness regarding extremely high rates of unemployment and underemployment, poverty, police brutality, and inadequate public services. The report continued that a largely poor black population was confined to the central cities while a predominantly white population moved out. That's called white flight. They're moving out to the newly formed suburbs. Okay? This all deals with redlining in the Federal Housing Act of about 1949. This deals with the U.S. Interstate Highway Acts of 1952 and 1956 that drove 41,000 miles of interstate highway all across the country and runs through about 1,600 African American communities, and their expressways running from the downtown business district out to the newly formed suburbs. Okay? These are things that take place after World War II. You have to understand that chronology of history. World War II, men are coming back home. World War II ends in 1945. They come back home. This starts the baby boomer generation. Men coming back home, having babies. The wives are having babies. Men ain't having babies. But the wives are having babies. Their families are expanding. They need housing. Okay? They're taking advantage of the GI Bill. This all deals with policy. The GI Bill. It was about $67 billion invested in the GI Bill from about 1945 to 1970. I did a whole broadcast. I did a whole separate video dealing with how there's about 1.2 million African American World War II veterans who were discriminated against in large when it came to the GI Bill, because the GI Bill gave money for college, low interest loans to buy homes, and then also loans to World War II veterans to start businesses. And then African American World War II veterans were largely discriminated against when it came to taking advantage of these policies and of this support, of this assistance that they earned. So the report continued that the largely poor black population was confined to central cities while a predominantly white population moved out of those cities, called white flight, and that the racism of white Americans was essentially responsible for the explosive mixture leading to the uprisings. Answering what can be done to prevent this in the future, the Kerner Commission suggested that the federal government intervene to improve housing, improve education, employment opportunities, and social services for African Americans. Okay, so this is dealing with an investment into the African American communities, which is what Dr. King is talking about. And he's saying as long as many white people saw us being brutalized on TV, trying to sit at the lunch counter or vote, a lot of them said, okay, let them have that. But then when we start talking about reallocation of resources, now it's a problem. Okay, so let me back that up. Let's continue.
Outraged about...
Let me back this up a little bit here.
Name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of this period of transition. Has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we're getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality. And they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here and changed, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Apart from wanting to live better, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they've become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology, and nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class. But do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class, or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, a background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. And it seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood on the Lincoln Memorial that day in August '63, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South.
Okay, so everybody pay like close attention to this, okay? Because when people talk about Dr. King, this, what he's saying here, this oftentimes is not talked about, okay? One, the quote-unquote "I Have a Dream" speech was not originally titled "I Have a Dream." It wasn't about a dream. It was originally titled "Normalcy Never Again." Then it was called "A Canceled Check." It wasn't about a dream. It was about calling out America on America's hypocrisy and talking about a promissory note given to us 100 years prior in 1863. And when we take that promissory note to the bank, it's marked insufficient funds. And he's talking about dismantling white supremacy. That's what he talks about in the speech. Okay. Also, the main fight was desegregation, not integration. The main fight in general, the civil rights movement, was desegregation. We weren't talking about giving up our businesses, and he talked about, you know, Afro-American community and aspects of it, things like this. We wanted first-class citizenship. We wanted all of our rights, but not to give up what we had. Okay. Sometimes they use the term integration, but the real fight was for desegregation, which is a different concept, is a different understanding. So let's go to this. Then I'm going to go to the day Dr. King met Malcolm X, and we're going to get out of here because it's been a long day and I'm tired.
You could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64, 1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments, and I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.
Dr. King, even if there had not been a war in Asia, would you still not have had this nightmare insofar as the Negro movement for equality then touched on two things that the white community holds sacred: their children and their property?
Oh, I have no doubt that we would have encountered great difficulties, great problems of resistance, if the war had not been in existence. So that I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended. But I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, a Negro was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence, and it strengthened the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult, because I think we can go along with some programs, if we didn't have this war on our hands, that would cause people to adjust to new developments, just as they did in the South. They said they'd never ride the bus with us, blood would flow in the streets, they wouldn't go to school, and all of these things. But when people came to see that they had to do it because the law insisted, they finally adjusted. And I think white people all over this country will adjust once the nation makes it clear that in schools and housing, we've got to learn to live together as brothers. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
All right, so that was for May 8th, 1967, NBC News. It was digitally restored a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and that was Sander Vanocur, Vanocur, who was the interviewer of NBC News interviewing Dr. King. Okay, so that is Dr. King 67, and people need to go back and watch it. That's on YouTube. Okay, MLK talks new phase of civil rights struggle 11 months before his assassination. Because that's deep. Because most people, I hear people talk about Dr. King, they haven't studied him. I listen to them tell they haven't studied Dr. King. And he's talking about a progression in the movement. He's talking about moving from civil rights to human rights. Okay, so he said a lot there, and that ties into the results of the Kerner Commission report, which were revealed in March of 1968. a month before he was assassinated. March of 1968, and it talked about investment in the African American community, etc. And it was ignored, but largely ignored by President Johnson. But President Johnson was dealing with the Vietnam War, and Dr. King talked about how it was harder to get their issues addressed in a time of the Vietnam War, how the Vietnam War dominated the news coverage. So when you have the Poor People's Campaign, he understood you got to have this massive movement of not just African Americans. You got to have this massive movement involving poor white people as well. Okay? Because you're trying to get these issues addressed, and you ain't going to be able to just do it with just black people. All right, so everybody check that out. Now, if we look at, and I'll do some other broadcasts because I got a ton of information here. When we talk about Malcolm X, so a lot of people see the famous pictures of Dr. King and Malcolm X. They only met one time, March 26, 1964, during the U.S. Senate debate for the Civil Rights Act of 64. Okay, and I talked about this some on my show Sunday night. Okay, Sunday, June 19th? Sunday, June 19th, yeah. January 19th, Sunday, January 19th. So, when we talk about Malcolm, we have to understand chronology. And I encourage people, of course, to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Also read this book, Martin Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. The cover may look different. I got this back in '94. Martin Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare by James H. Cone. Because toward the end of both of their lives, their ideologies were converging. Now, Malcolm was 4 years older than Dr. King. Okay? But they were both 39 years old when they were assassinated. March 8, 1964, Malcolm officially separates from the Nation of Islam. So when we talk about Malcolm, we have to understand chronology and context, and whether it was before he went to Mecca or after he went to Mecca. March 26, 1964 is before Malcolm goes to Mecca. Late April 1964, the next month, Malcolm goes to Mecca on his Hajj, and then he goes to 14 different African nations. Okay. When Malcolm meets Dr. King, Malcolm tells Dr. King, quote, "I'm throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle," end quote. Because some of the aspects of Malcolm that are not talked about is that Malcolm joins the civil rights movement when he separates from the Nation of Islam. When Malcolm delivers his speech, The Ballad of the Bullet, April 3rd, 1964 in Cleveland, Ohio, and April 4th, 1964 in Detroit, Michigan, Malcolm is talking about interjecting black nationalism to the civil rights movement. A lot of people don't know this. When you go, if you read the book Malcolm X Speaks, edited with prefatory notes by George Brightman, this has a lot of Malcolm's speeches after he leaves the Nation of Islam. So his speech he delivered April 3rd, 1964, Cleveland, Ohio, is in here, Ballad of the Bullet. So that speech is given before Malcolm goes to Mecca. Okay? But Malcolm was calling for a unification of the civil rights leaders before he goes on his Hajj to Mecca. And before he separates from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's calling for a unification of the civil rights leaders and their followers. And he says we have to find a common solution to a common problem posed by a common enemy. So July 31st, 1963, while Malcolm is still in the Nation of Islam, he sends a letter to the leading civil rights leaders, of the big six civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, and he requests a meeting with them. Okay? Now, as Dr. John Henry Clark teaches us, and as well as Professor James Small and Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and Professor James Small and Dr. Leonard Jeffries are two of my teachers, the civil rights movement in this country was happening concurrently with the African liberation movement on the continent of Africa. They're happening at the same time. They're drawing inspiration from each other and learning from each other. 1957, when Ghana wins its independence from Great Britain, and Kwame Nkrumah becomes president of Ghana, Dr. King goes to the celebration in Ghana in 1957 to be with Kwame Nkrumah. And he goes back each year on the anniversary of their independence. A lot of people don't know this about Dr. King. He studied the movements in Africa. He studied African history also. So there's a good article from AtlantaBlackStar.com called How Steel Sharpened Steel. How Steel Sharpened Steel. The connection between the civil rights movement and African independence movements. This is from April 3rd, 2016 by Jamal Bradley. And then also the article that I cited from SmithsonianMag.com that is written by James C. Cobb. James C. Cobb from April 4th, 2018. Because I write articles, so I like to give credit to the authors of the article, the writers of the articles as well. So very briefly here, an excerpt from How Steel Sharpens Steel. It talks about, let's see, on the other side of Africa in Ghana, the illustrious W.B. Du Bois Memorial Center also bears the name of the great black American intellectual. Okay, let me back up. It says in the center of Nairobi, Kenya, there's a street with dozens of shops that sell school uniforms and household goods. The street, which also has a few restaurants, is well known as it crosses through one of the main stages for matatas or microbuses, M-A-T-A-T-U-S, that run through the city. The street's name is Du Bois Road, named after Dr. W.B. Du Bois or Du Bois. On the other side of Africa, in Ghana, the illustrious Dr. W.B. Du Bois Memorial Center also bears the name of the great African American intellectual. At Lincoln University, the oldest historically black college in America, located in southeastern Pennsylvania, one of the buildings just past the front gate is Ezekwe Nkrumah Hall, named after Nnamdi Ezekwe, the first president of Nigeria, and Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Okay, this is at Lincoln University. Both are among the alumni. Both went to Lincoln University. All across Africa, on the backs of buses and other forms of transportation, you'll see pictures of Muhammad Ali, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. And what makes this important is that they are not simply a coincidence. One of the most dynamic periods in African history was during the 1950s and 1960s, when many African nations achieved independence from the European colonial powers. In 1957, Ghana gained its independence. 1957, Ghana gained its independence from Britain, and was soon followed by 17 other African nations in 1960 and numerous others in the following years. Independence leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Ezekwe, Patrice Lumumba, Sékou Touré, and others were influential in developing the political and cultural structure to make independence a reality. Interestingly enough, one of the most dynamic periods in African American history was in the 1950s and 60s in what is commonly known as the Civil Rights era. During this time, African Americans began to further assert their rights, not just their American rights, but also their human rights as citizens of the world. What should be known is that these two movements were not completely separated. These two movements were not completely separated, nor were the ideas and strategies implemented independent of one another. By the 1950s, many Africans began to take advantage of the opportunity to study in the United States. And due to the racial nature of American society during that era, most students attended historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. As noted, Lincoln University boasts 2 African presidents as alumni. And other HBCUs during that era had numerous students from across the continent. The development and change which occurred in Africa and America were contemporary movements. The development and change which occurred in Africa and America were contemporary movements, and their collective success were viewed as such. The African leaders and people were very much influenced by their experiences in America at HBCUs and their time spent living, taking and learning among African American activists and thinkers. Kwame Nkrumah was so much influenced by his time in America that he would name Ghana's football team the Black Stars, which was named after the shipping line company started by Marcus Garvey. During the 1950s and 60s, and in the subsequent independence era, a number of African Americans were invited to Africa to give advice on overcoming the colonial system. Independence leaders recognized the benefit of American ideas and saw African Americans as natural allies to their nations. The contribution of Dr. W.B. Du Bois was invaluable in that he offered a scholarly critique of colonialism at the United Nations, and he offered advice and regular feedback in African independence leaders and regular feedback to African independence leaders in their nascent years. His assistance would be rewarded in the latter years of his life as he relocated to Ghana, where he would serve as a personal advisor to Kwame Nkrumah until his death. And it was from the spirit of the African independence movements that many African American leaders began to envision their own struggle for human rights in America. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. attended Ghana's independence ceremony and went on to note, quote, "This event, the birth of this nation, will give impetus to oppressed peoples all over the world. I think it will have worldwide implications and repercussions, not only for Asia and Africa, but also for America. It renews my conviction in the ultimate triumph of justice," end quote. In addition to Dr. King, other figures such as Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. from Harlem, A. Philip Randolph, Ralph Bunche, Horace Mann Bond, and others traveled to Ghana for the ceremony. During this era, many American government leaders began to view the civil rights movement with greater suspicion and actively began to monitor its leaders and their international ties. In the late 1950s, Malcolm X would go on a fact-finding mission on behalf of Elijah Muhammad. I think that was about 1959, but would make his more important and ultimately influential trip to Africa in 1964 upon leaving the Nation of Islam. It was during this trip to Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, Liberia, Egypt, Algeria, Ethiopia, Morocco, Tanzania, then known as Tanganyika, and Guinea, that Malcolm X began to further refine his position on race and the struggle for African Americans. Malcolm X noted that in Africa, the people were able to achieve a higher level of independence and freedom than in America, quote, which is supposed to be the citadel of freedom, end quote. It was during his trip to Africa and the support he received from leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ben Bella, and others that Malcolm X formulated his ideas to take the case of African Americans to the United Nations. Malcolm X's trips to Africa were the impetus to transform his challenge to America's treatment of African Americans as not just an issue of civil rights, but one of human rights. He noted how the atrocities committed in Africa, Hungary, Latin America, the Congo, and among the Jewish people of the Soviet Union were brought before the United Nations, yet the problems of African Americans were relegated to the United States. Many observers have identified this shift in Malcolm's strategy actually made him a bigger threat to the global influence of the American government and quite possibly led to his untimely death. Okay, check out the rest of this article. This is called How Steel Sharpened Steel, the connection between the civil rights movement and the independence independence movements in Africa by Jamal Bradley from AtlantaBlackStar.com. They called it Black Star, referring to the Black Star line of ships from Marcus Garvey. That's why it's called Black Star. Okay, this is from 2016. How you doing, Angela, Eric? How's everybody doing? Willie, how you doing, Willie, down in West Memphis? All right. Willie Clarence Holman, how you doing, Willie? Okay, so everybody read this article in its entirety, because there's more to it. I just don't have time to get through it. But see, this ties the African liberation movement to the civil rights movement. They're happening at the same time. In the documentary A Great and Mighty Walk about Dr. John Henrik Clarke, they talk about this. So Dr. John Henrik Clarke is going to help Malcolm X organize the Organization of Afro-American Unity that Malcolm sets up after he comes back from his Hajj and traveling to 14 different African nations as well. Dr. John Henrik Clarke, one of our great Grandmaster Scholar warriors. When Malcolm goes to Ghana, he's going to meet Maya Angelou there in Ghana. Maya Angelou is going to end up coming back to the U.S. to help Malcolm also organize the Organization of Afro-American Unity as well. So Maya Angelou worked with Dr. King and she worked with Malcolm X. But very quickly here, if we look at this article, Martin Luther King Jr. met Malcolm X just once. The photo still haunts us. Wait a second, hold on. We still on? Let me see. Okay, we're still on. Okay, good, good. Everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in as well. Hopefully you all like this type of information. Subscribe to our fan page, the African History Network. Also, our Facebook fan page, also my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. And then I have for African American History Month, we have a 15 DVD bundle pack, which is now 16 DVDs because I added an additional one. And this includes a lot of my lectures in the past few years. It's a $250 value on sale, $100. It's right on the homepage of AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We'll post a link here as well. And it has a ton of information. It has my lectures dealing with Dr. King, Malcolm X, deal with a lot of our history. So check this out as well. The Michael Imhotep Black History Month 15 DVD bundle pack. We'll post a link here also. Okay. All right. So let's look at this article quickly here. So Malcolm X sends a letter to the leading civil rights leaders. The one he sent to Dr. King is the letter is dated July 31st, 1963. The return address was Muhammad's Mosque, number 7. 113 Lenox Avenue, New York, New York. And Malcolm was calling for a unification of the civil rights leaders. Okay, he said that it was a shame that he talked about President Kennedy meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and he said despite their tremendous ideological differences, it's a disgrace for Negro leaders not to be able to submerge our minor differences in order to seek a common solution to a common problem posed by a common enemy. Okay? And Malcolm warned that a racial explosion is more destructive than a nuclear explosion. He was requesting a meeting with them. Now, this is the month before the March on Washington. And Malcolm attended the March on Washington. He called it the farce on Washington. Okay? Now, after he leaves the Nation of Islam, he gets involved in the civil rights movement. He takes back the negative things he said about civil rights leaders, things like this. There was a meeting that Juanita Poitier had at her house. Juanita Poitier was the first wife of Sidney Poitier. And they had this meeting with Malcolm and the leading civil rights leaders. Dr. King couldn't attend, so he sent a surrogate for them to get all their differences out on the table and work together. If you watch the documentary called Make It Plain, Make It Plain was probably the best documentary on Malcolm. They talk about this in that documentary. Okay? So Malcolm invited Dr. King to a rally that August 1967 in Harlem, New York, to analyze the race problem and a solution. He promised to moderate the meeting and guarantee courtesy for each speaker. He requested that if Dr. King could not attend, to send a representative closing the letter with an endearment, your brother Malcolm X. So Dr. King declined the invitation and did not send a representative, according to the book Malcolm and the Cross, The Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and Christianity by Louis A. DeCaro Jr. We know the March on Washington takes place August 28, 1963. And personally, I think that Dr. King may not have been ready to go there and meet Malcolm then. This is in 63. It was supposed to take place, not 67. It was supposed to take place, the meeting was supposed to take place in 63. Okay, August 1963, not 1967. Because Malcolm was, he was already killed by then. But February 24th, 1966, Dr. King meets with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. A lot of people don't know this. Dr. King and Coretta Scott King go to Elijah Muhammad's house in Chicago, and they meet with Dr. King meets with Elijah Muhammad. So this is about almost a year to the date after Malcolm is assassinated. And when we look at these different figures, we are shown them as being opposites. But we don't know that Dr. King and Muhammad Ali had a secret friendship. We don't know that Dr. King, when Malcolm meets Dr. King, he talks about joining the civil rights movement, throwing his effort into the heart of the civil rights movement. We don't know that when Malcolm is assassinated, Dr. King sends a telegram or letter to Betty Shabazz. And Dr. King said, quote, "While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I had always a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem," end quote. When we look at what Dr. King said about the Nation of Islam, if we look at his last book, where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? Page 132 and 133. And let me flip back over to the screen here. Page 132 and 133. So Dr. King is talking about a number of things. So this chapter is entitled, what's the name of this chapter? Just one second here. The Dilemma of Negro Americans. The Dilemma of Negro Americans. Now chapter 2 is called Black Power. Read that too. But Dr. King is talking about group unity and the need for group unity. And he says, on page 132, he says, there are still too many Negro churches that are so absorbed in a future good over yonder that they condition their members to adjust to the present evils over here. Too many Negro newspapers have veered away from their traditional role as protest organs agitating for social change, and have turned to the sensational and the conservative in place of the substantive and the militant. Too many Negro social professional groups have degenerated into snobbishness and a preoccupation with frivolities and trivial activity. But the failures of the past must not be an excuse for the inaction of the present and the future. These groups must be mobilized and motivated. This form of group unity can do infinitely more to liberate the Negro than any action of individuals. We have been oppressed as a group, and we must overcome the oppression as a group. We have been oppressed as a group, and we must overcome the oppression as a group. So this is Dr. King. So he wrote this book in 1967. This was his last book. It was late 1967 he wrote the book. Malcolm is calling for a unification of the civil rights leaders and their followers in July 1963, before he leads the Nation of Islam. Dr. King is calling for a unification also. Through this form of group unity, we can begin a constructive program which will vigorously seek to improve our personal standards. It is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of high maturity to rise to the level of self-criticism. Through group unity, we must convey to one another that our women must be respected, and that life is too precious to be destroyed in a Saturday night brawl or a gang execution. Through community agencies and religious institutions, we must develop a positive program through which Negro youth can become adjusted to urban living and improve their general level of behavior. So then he goes on to talk about the Nation of Islam. This is what he says. While I strongly disagree with their separatist black supremacy philosophy, I have nothing but admiration for what our Muslim brothers have done to rehabilitate ex-convicts, dope addicts, and men and women who, through despair and self-hatred, have sunk to moral degeneracy. This must be attempted on a much larger scale and without the negative overtones that accompany black Muslimism. Okay? So this is Dr. King praising the Nation of Islam. Their ability to instill self-pride in people, get people off of drugs, things like this. The self-respect they instill. Most people don't know Dr. King said that, because we're always showed Dr. King and Malcolm as being polar opposites. Their ideologies are convergent. They're not polar opposites. And in many respects, Malcolm was playing the role of the crazy Negro. Follow me here, because there's another video, and I got to find it. There's another video where Malcolm said that they would do best to give Dr. King what he's asking for. Because if they don't deal with him, other people are going to come along, and they're going to have a harsher alternative, and they'll be forced to deal with them. I'm paraphrasing what he said. So if you understand, like, good cop, bad cop, Malcolm is playing a crazy Negro that's scaring white people and pushing them towards Dr. King. If you understand good cop, bad cop, and you follow this throughout. You know, Malcolm said a lot of things that were true, things like that, of course. But when you understand this, like, full circle, and see, when Malcolm is in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm felt that the nation should get involved in the civil rights movement also. If you watch the documentary Make It Plain, they talk about that. This is why Malcolm joins the civil rights movement, and he's talking about injecting black nationalism into the civil rights movement. Okay? Yes, he organizes the Organization of Afro-American Unity, but when you study that, June 28, 1964, you look at the speech he gave and the platform he lays out, he talks about a political agenda, an economic agenda, educational agenda. If you go to blackpast.org, they had a transcript of the speech. It's about 12, 14 pages, something like that. Because I've gone through and read it. So this is why when you study the Ballad of the Bullet by Malcolm, you have to read it. You can't just listen to it. You got to read it and understand chronology and context. That speech was given before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law, because there was a filibuster taking place. Malcolm goes March 26, 1964 to watch the debate of the Civil Rights Act, but there's a filibuster taking place. So that speech was given before it was signed into law, before it passes Congress and it's signed into law. What's going to push it over the top to get it passed is June 21st, 1964, when Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, the three civil rights workers, are killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That's going to really push it over the top. And it's going to be signed into law July 2nd, 1964 by President Johnson. And then Malcolm is assassinated before the Voting Rights Act of 65 was signed into law August 6, 1965. So when you listen to Malcolm and when you actually read his speeches, we have to understand chronology and context as well. Okay, Philip says, sure won't hear that in the media. Right. Exactly. Okay. So this is why this book here is so important. Malcolm X speech. The autobiography of Malcolm X is good, but this has like actually Malcolm X's speeches in it. Okay, that you could read speeches he gave after Legion of Nation Islam. And see, and as I talked about in my Kwanzaa presentation that I did December 27th at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, the term African American, we were using that term in the 1960s. The earliest recorded usage of the term African American goes back to May 15th, 1782 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But Malcolm used the term African Americans in the Ballad of the Bullet, April 3rd, 1964. Let me see, don't I have that bookmarked? Let's see, we had it here. Yeah, page 36. Right now in this country, if you and I, 22 million African Americans, that's what we are, Africans, who are in America. You're nothing but Africans. Nothing but Africans. In fact, you get farther calling yourself Africans instead of Negro. Africans don't catch hell. You're the only one catching hell. They don't have to pass civil rights bills for Africans. An African can go anywhere he wants right now. All you have to do is tie your head up. That's right, go anywhere you want. Just stop being just stop being a Negro. Change your name to an African name. He says Ooga Booga, but change your name to an African name. But once again, this is Malcolm before he goes to his tour on to 14 African countries. This is April 3rd, 1964. This is Malcolm. That'll show you how silly the white man is. You're dealing with a silly man. A friend of mine who's very dark put a turban on his head and went into a restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia, before they called themselves desegregated. He went into a restaurant. He sat down. He went to a white restaurant. He sat down. They served him, and he said, "What would happen if a Negro came in here?" And there he's sitting, black as night. But because he has his head wrapped up, the waitress looked back at him and says, "Why, there wouldn't be no N-word dare come in here." Okay? So you're dealing with a man whose bias and prejudice are making him lose his mind, his intelligence every day. He's frightened. He looks around and sees what's taking place on earth, and he sees that the pendulum of time is swinging in your direction. The dark people are waking up. They're losing their fear of the white man. No place where he's fighting right now is he winning. Everywhere he's fighting someone, you're in my complexion, and they're beating him. He can't win anymore. He's won his last battle. He failed to win the Korean War. He couldn't win it. He had to sign a truce. That's a loss. Anytime Uncle Sam, with all his machinery for warfare, is held to a draw by some rice eaters, he's lost the battle. Okay, so read. When we deal with Malcolm, we have to read Malcolm's speeches. Same thing with Dr. King. We have to read their speeches. We can't just sit there and listen and be entertained. We have to read and study their speeches. Okay, so Ernest, Philip. All right, so I'll do other broadcasts. That's enough for today. It's been a busy day. I'm already tired as it is. So follow us here on the Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Follow us here on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, as well. You can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, or $ the AHN show through Cash App. That really helps support the research and what we do. Helps us pay the bills, finance our Sunday night show, stay on the air. African American business owners, you can advertise with the African History Network. We can help you. We reach thousands of people across the country with our broadcasts and the audio podcasts of our shows. So all these broadcasts are also in audio podcast format on 8 different podcast platforms: iTunes, Castbox, Acast, FM Player, TuneIn, Blog Talk Radio. And our current promotion: buy 1 month, get 2 months free. We take your 30-second and 60-second audio commercial, put into the audio podcast of our various broadcasts, and including our Sunday night show. If you don't have a audio commercial, we can create one for you, no additional charge. And then also we promote your business through our Facebook Live broadcasts as well that I do also. Okay. So we still have a few slots available because we have limited inventory. We still have a few slots available. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com for more information. We can get you up and running today. So a lot of people want to get their credit in order, and Chandranet Middleton at rrrcreditservices.com can help you with this. Are you tired of having poor credit? Are you tired of paying those high double-digit interest rates? Would you like to purchase your dream home one day? If the answer is yes, contact rrrcreditservices.com for a free consultation. They are equipped to provide solutions which will enable you to rebuild your financial future. The affordable cost to become a new client is just $30 for the first month. They offer also a free consultation. Visit their website, rrrcreditservices.com, or give them a call, 1-800-607-1989, 1-800-607-1989, and either Chandranet or one of her assistants will take care of you. Let them know you found out about this from the African History Network as well. Now, a lot of people are have problems finding shoes because they need wide shoe sizes. And the Simply Wide Shoe Outlet can help you with this. Visit their website, simplywide.com, simplywide.com. They are a wide shoe outlet. They have sizes up to 15 double E. They have Naturalizer, Pro Spirit, a number of different brands. Visit their website, simplywide.com, simplywide.com. They also have a brick and mortar location in Maryland, in the Maryland area as well. So those in the DMV area, visit 4279 Branch Avenue, Marlow Heights, Maryland. 4279 Branch Avenue, Marlow Heights, Maryland. Give them a call, 301-702-1401, 301-702-1401. And also you can visit their website and order from their website, simplywide.com. They have men and women's sizes up to 15 double E. Brands include Naturalizer, Soft Spots, Ross Homerson, Pro Pet, Walking Cradles, and Easy Street. Let them know you found out about this from the African History Network. All right, look, hey, we have to get out of here. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Remember, right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time, and listen to our and watch the radio show I do, the African History Network show, Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, WFDF. We also broadcast on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, and our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep. All right, right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Oh, also, if you want me, I'll be speaking different places for African American History Month, February. If you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization, email me, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. All right, talk to you next time. Peace.